in the relative to all of the other medicines that we use that we're still learning about, we know less about psychedelics than we do about most of that other stuff. So this field is just so new.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Webdelics podcast, where we're on a journey to find out the truth about psychedelics and plant medicine, get rid of the myths, and change the narrative. I'm your host, Scott Mason, and I am so excited about our guest today, the one and only Deanna Kaplan. Deanna, I see you across the screen. Tell us all about yourself.
Thanks so much for having me, Scott. It's great to be here with you and with the whole Webdelics audience. I'm Deanna Kaplan. I am trained as a clinical psychologist. Right now, I wear the hat of assistant professor in the Emory University School of Medicine. And as a human being, I am a person who has always been very interested in changes in consciousness and how it is that we as human beings grow and evolve. And I've made my professional work the science of how we try to study and measure that as well as we possibly can. And I think that's some of what we're going to get to talk about today. And so I'm very excited.
I am excited too, just hearing about that. Thank you for being more than just a resume. Thank you for bringing your whole humanity into the house today. With that, I will now officially say, Deanna, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you. So, the topic of today's discussion is the science behind the science of psychedelics. How we study these substances and what might be behind the study of those substances that we as people who are diving deeper and deeper into the psychedelic renaissance all need to know and understand. So, Deanna, I'm just going to start with a little bit of a story here. For those who have been following this show from the beginning, I started Webdelics and its podcast not knowing anything about psychedelics, except maybe someone's loopy Aunt Beatrice in San Francisco had done some LSD in the 60s. That was all I knew. And I learned a lot as I got to interview qualified, extraordinarily knowledgeable guests like you, and eventually made a decision to take my own journey using psilocybin to deal with some of the traumas that I had faced in my life. I'll always tell people what I say right now, which is that regarding that psilocybin journey, there was a before and there was an after. And that's a line in the sand that can never be undrawn. But a decision had to be made. I made it based on the science as I understood it. And it wasn't just my decision. My spouse was involved in this too, because it is my brain. And it's not, hey, once you're married, it ain't just your brain, right? You're sharing that brain with somebody else. And thinking about that decision as we had our conversation prior to this show, you got me to realize that the science behind these substances, perhaps we could even start with psilocybin, is to some extent limited by the fact that they've been illegal to study. So perhaps you could explain to us how we know what we do scientifically about these substances since they've been illegal to study.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you so much for sharing about the potent experience that you so very recently had. I hope that we'll get to maybe talk about that a little bit more in the conversation, in part just because when we're talking about scientific concepts that can get more complicated, I think it's really helpful to be able to ground that in a personal experience and a reference point. So I hope that we can come back to that. To answer your question, I think the place to sort of start is just with acknowledging that the science of psychedelics is really in its infancy. We have a many thousands of years history of people who have been ingesting psychedelics, taking plant medicines, originally often in very ritualistic contexts. Now we're starting to study these from a scientific perspective, and often a sort of psychiatric, psychopharmacological perspective. But that science is very new. It's decades old, and it's really only in recent years that we have started to see a rapid growth in the amount of research that has really been possible to do. And so that just means that we have a very new science and we have some preliminary evidence, but we are almost definitely going to find out in a few years that some things that we think we know now are going to turn out not to be quite correct. And there are also a lot of questions that we really should ask that we just haven't been able to ask yet.
There was a lot in that little statement to analyze more deeply. I'm going to start. I'm sure there are going to be a zillion different little rabbit holes that we can dig. I'm going to make sure that we dig through all of them.
Dig all day.
Right. This might be a 10-hour episode, but we'll keep it under control to the best of our ability. Let me start with saying, you're saying that the science is new. Some of the things that we think we know, we might not know. Deanna, that strikes fear into my little heart. What exactly do you mean there?
What I mean by that, and I don't mean to strike fear, because there are certainly some very, very good studies out there already. What I mean by that is that when we think about a scientific evidence base, there are many different levels of evidence that we can have. And the very highest level of evidence comes from having very large studies that have followed randomized controlled trials that have been replicated in many different populations, so with diverse groups of people. And we can aggregate all of that evidence together across many, many, many studies. That's how we get to our very highest level of evidence. We're not there yet. Right now, the scientific literature, often we're relying on small studies because this research is quite expensive to do. Often we are relying on pretty what we call homogeneous populations. So not necessarily a lot of diversity in the research samples. And it is sometimes pretty difficult to do a randomized controlled trial just because these studies are so small. A randomized controlled trial, by definition, just requires a larger number of people to participate. So all I meant when I said that is that we just don't have a lot of evidence to go on yet. And often what happens in science is that as we accumulate more evidence, the result of any one study might wind up being challenged a bit, or sometimes even refuted by studies that are larger or that have more rigorous designs. And we don't know quite what happens yet because we're still accumulating that evidence. But it is, of course, possible that of the studies that are out there now, we may later learn that when we have larger groups and more diverse groups, we find something slightly different.
You're raising, though, underneath all of that, some interesting issues. On the one hand, you, as well as anyone who knows anything about the psychedelic world, would concede people have been ingesting these substances, and particularly, as you mentioned earlier, in very controlled circumstances, such as shamanistic rituals and things like that, for thousands of years. On the other hand, those ingestions, the consequences of those rituals, though that sort of engagement of populations with psychedelics, as you have just stated, really hasn't been the subject of a rigorous, empirically based study set. And so, on the one hand, if we were to examine substances like psilocybin or MDMA or some of the other psychedelics as from a scientific perspective before making a decision to go on a journey like the one I made, from that perspective, we're acting like a human guinea pig. On the other hand, after thousands of years, you'd think that the human guinea pig period might be over. I mean, people have also been eating sugar, or well, maybe that's a bad example, but they've been eating sugar, or they've been eating corn, or they've been eating cows for thousands of years, right? Like, do we need to have empirical studies to show that eating protein, I don't know, helps you be strong and healthy? How do you sort of mitigate that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think context matters a lot here. And I want to start by saying that it's not a negative that we haven't done a lot of scientific research. And certainly, I don't at all want to detract from the cultural meaning and value, from the powerful and impactful and positive experiences that people have had with these medicines across centuries. That's not the point here at all. And I think something that is worth acknowledging, and I will just tell you, I'm not a scholar in this particular area, so I'm going to say something that's sort of surface level, but I think it's important to acknowledge in the context that these medicines have often been used historically. There is often quite a lot of cultural conversation and preparation. There's a container for that use that is specific to that culture. And the container for use that is specific to our culture here in 2024 in the United States, when we're talking about the science, is often this question of using a psychedelic agent to address depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, fear of death. The context is, can we use these things to do to treat things that we often treat in other types of ways using clinical medicine? And so that's a very different context. And that is a context where science becomes important, both for reasons of preparation and safety, but we also start to get into other things like, will your insurance cover it? And where can you go to get this type of care? And so I think that the answer to that question is that science matters, I think, really when we're talking about these through the lens of science and through the lens of medicine, if that makes sense.
It does, and I hear what you're saying. It's one thing to say, I want to go to my doctor and ask him or her for a prescription, basically, to go see, or for a referral to go see a specialist in, say, ketamine treatment for a psychological disorder that I'm facing. It's another thing to say, well, on my spare time, with my own money, and knowing the risk that I myself, and I'm assuming, I feel like taking a trip to Peru and having an ayahuasca ceremony is going to help me. I get that, and that actually does help provide some clarity around the role of science here. But you also said something a little bit earlier. Sometimes these studies might end up showing that there are some things that we really weren't expecting. And what immediately comes to mind as an example of how that could look might be cigarettes. Right? Studying that, after a while, we began to see that there was an association with lung cancer. Are you saying that, and this is another area that I've got to be honest, it scares me. What if after having done the psilocybin experience, I find out 10 years from now that there is an association with some bizarre disorder with those that use psilocybin, and the ancient cultures that used it, well, they might not have ever made that association for a whole host of reasons that might not have ever been detected historically. What on earth can we do with that sort of possibility out there? How realistic is that possibility at all in any way?
It's a good question, Scott. I cannot see into the future, but when I'm thinking about what could go wrong, that's actually not something that I'm worried about.
Oh.
I could stand corrected, but I would be somewhat surprised if 50 years from now we learn that there is a new onset disorder that we don't know anything about today that is associated with occasional use of psychedelics. That would come as a big surprise to me, Scott. I think that said, we're still learning quite a bit about risks. So just to sort of name a couple of the big ones,
Yeah.
there can be cardiovascular risk that is associated with ingesting a psychedelic. So particularly psilocybin and MDMA both increase heart rate, both increase blood pressure. And this is not dangerous for most people, but it can be dangerous for somebody who has a heart problem or other form of cardiovascular disease. There can also be psychiatric risk. So this is an area where the research is still growing, but we have some evidence that that we should use caution when thinking about psychedelics for anybody who has a diagnosed psychotic disorder or bipolar disorder. This doesn't mean that it's a total no-go. It just means that assessment and evaluation for appropriateness and also just appropriate safety monitoring might be very important. Sorry, go ahead.
No, please proceed.
I was just going to say another kind of category of risk. This is a little more amorphous, but I think it's important to talk about. So probably every Webdelics listener has heard of a bad trip, maybe has had a bad trip. And bad trips don't necessarily always become later interpreted as bad. So it sometimes happens that somebody has a trip that feels bad in the moment, even terrifying in the moment, but later on that becomes a meaningful, useful, and even instructive experience that the person is very glad to have had. That also doesn't always happen. It sometimes happens that a bad trip is just a bad trip. And it sometimes happens that these experiences can cause people ongoing distress for a long time. And these are the sorts of things that I think are very important for us to study, not necessarily because it means we shouldn't be using psychedelics because of them, but because we need to have the science to support people who have had these experiences so that they can be integrated in a way that is helpful and constructive.
Well, then it also says, going back to what you mentioned earlier, once science around the risks associated with these substances as well as their benefits has hit a certain level, and they are able to be more easily integrated into the medical infrastructure that we have, I would imagine then protocols could be put in place so that doctors or psychologists or other healthcare providers aren't terrified to make the referral. Because if we don't know the full extent of these long-term psychiatric or other psychological impacts, and I'm a doctor and I am entering that stuff into my managed care's computer system for the referral, and someone goes into some horrible state that lasts for years, I could end up sued, and that might make me so risk averse that I never avail these treatments of anybody.
Exactly. And I think a good analog to this that everyone is probably familiar with is just ibuprofen. So ibuprofen, it's over the counter. It's generally regarded as quite safe. It is also the case that it can cause stomach irritation and even bleeding. And it's not the best idea for somebody who has chronic gut inflammation or other stomach problems to take ibuprofen, especially on an empty stomach. And every doctor knows this, and every pharmacist knows this, and you can get this medical advice essentially everywhere. And it's important medical advice because otherwise we would be having people who are having these problems and side effects without knowing that. And so the purpose is not to make it such that people can't use these medicines or even prescribe them. It's really just so that we know how to make these agents safe for everyone.
You talked a few minutes ago about some of the known contraindications for a successful psychedelic experience, such as blood pressure or known specific mental health challenges that people have. When I did my psilocybin journey, there was a period in which it appears as though it was sort of integrating itself into my system. And then all of a sudden, I knew I was in. And when I knew I was in, Deanna, I was so scared. I remember telling the shaman that I was working with, who had, by the way, done an fairly extensive medical background history into me. But I remember telling him, what if I never come out of this? What if I die? What if I'm allergic to mushrooms and I don't know this until now? And when that was happening, I could feel my heart flying, and my entire left side, my left arm, my left leg, even parts of my abdomen were quaking. And then it sort of went into the other side of my chest. Now, this horrible, frightening thing switched off. And the revelation that I had from this particular portion of my journey was that I had more control over my fear than I realized, and that fear was more temporary than I had experienced it as previously. And that's something I've taken with me. But I can absolutely understand if someone who had dangerously high blood pressure or a weak heart or whatever and started to have this sort of thing happen, might literally be at risk. If you know what these risks are, or if these risks are out there, at what point can you, me, our spouses, those that we love say, okay, the science is at a place where the decisions that we're making are grounded in a level of study that the average person can feel comfortable with, and that whoever is administering these experiences can have some predictions about the outcomes with regards to?
It's a great question, Scott. The question is, in a way, you're asking, what is the bar for a scientific truth? Like, how do we know when we've really got it? And it's potentially a high bar. So, for example, SSRIs, which is the frontline psychiatric class of medicines often used for anxiety and depression, we actually don't have a very good idea of how those work scientifically. There's evidence of effects that they have. So there's evidence that in many people, they do reduce depression symptoms and do reduce anxiety symptoms. How they do that, there's a whole lot that we don't know. And so if the aim is to reach the scientific threshold of, I will use this once we really know exactly what it is and how it works and what will happen and what won't happen, I think we'll probably all be waiting past our lifetimes.
Yeah, right. Like, why am I running around so scared beginning in this conversation around psilocybin when people are taking these other drugs we don't know anything about all the time? Right? Mm-hmm. Just a little.
It's an individual choice, I think. And I think the thing to know, and honestly, this is how I approach medical decision making for myself, when I've had to go to the doctor for something or, consider a procedure or something like that. The best that we can do is look at the evidence that's there and think about our own value system and what we want for our life. And then we make an educated guess and a choice. But I do think it is good for Webdelics listeners to know that this science is in its infancy, because that can be an important data point for making that choice.
I'm going to get a little bit existential here.
Let's do it.
I love it. That was what I was hoping you'd say. Okay, we'll do it. So I might take an antidepressant. I might take minoxidil to get my hair to grow. I might take an acne medicine to make sure my skin looks pretty. I might stick Juvederm in my cheeks, to give me those golf balls there that I'm so desperate to have. But all of those, to my knowledge, might affect the chemistry of various parts of the body, including the brain, but they're not shifting consciousness. They're not bringing in an altered state of being. You don't have people saying, I took this medicine to help the fungus on my toenails, and suddenly I'm starting to see aliens in my backyard. So one of the things that I'm curious about your thoughts on is, can science ever really wrap itself around substances that have inherently a metaphysical component? Because metaphysical component, spiritual components, alien beings from other dimensions, unless we're talking about some real Star Trek level scientific breakthroughs, those aren't the realm of science. Is science even the appropriate way then to assess the viability of these substances?
I love this question, Scott. I think that science can. I'm a bit of an optimist. I think it can. I think this requires a bit of a paradigm shift in how we think about how to do this science. I will also say that I don't think that science is the only way of knowing. There are so many ways of knowing out there. Science is one of them. I am a scientist by training and by profession. I personally also put a lot of stock into what my non-scientific intuitive gut tells me about things. I think our bodies hold a lot of wisdom. There are many, many ways of knowing, and science is just one of them. That said, I think we can get there. We just have to think about the scientific problem a little bit differently than we have over the last many decades.
Well, you just titillated me with that little last sentence.
Well, so kind of couple of points here. We can think about, let's go back to SSRIs. Let's go back to that example of let's just say Prozac. So this is a medicine that we have used psychiatrically. We've been studying it for some years. And as you said, something that is quite different about an SSRI, even though it's a medicine that is generally used to try to produce some sort of change in how we feel and maybe even how we experience the world, it has a very different effect. So anybody who has ever taken an SSRI knows that the first thing that your doctor will tell you about taking this medicine is that after you take it, you're not going to notice a thing. And you probably won't notice a thing for about 2 to 3 weeks until the medicine accumulates in your system. And in fact, it is the case that if we give somebody an SSRI and that person has a instantaneous, profound, life-changing experience, we would be quite worried about something like psychosis or a manic episode, because this is just not what SSRIs are supposed to do. Psychedelics, totally different ballgame. This is exactly what a psychedelic is supposed to do. And really what this means is that it challenges us, it challenges the psychiatric community, my field of clinical psychology, to start asking different types of questions. We have to start asking the question of what is this profound change that happens for people? We have to start asking the question of, what does it mean when somebody has a profound spiritual or mystical or religious experience? We have to ask the question of what that might have to do with their treatment. These are all things that the fields of psychology and psychiatry have sort of largely eschewed. And we just can't do that anymore. So it actually presents a pretty phenomenal opportunity for the field to start to look at human suffering and transformation in a brand new way.
I can't help but wonder too, as I listen to you say that, and then thinking about your own description of yourself as a scientist by trade, but in terms of your general thinking and the way you experience the world is something much broader than that. Something that was very interesting about my own experience, and that I have heard from other guests as well, has been the fact that the journey that I went on while on psilocybin was by and large symbolic. For instance, right at the beginning, after the fear episode I told you about earlier, I saw Anubis, the Egyptian god of death.
Wow.
And Anubis was pointing me on a river. And I went on a canoe on this river, and this river took me over the edge to an abyss. This sequence of events has stayed with me. And again, I cannot emphasize this enough, completely changed how I view myself, the world, and the way that I operate in it. Because the god of death, to me, symbolized change, stepping into it. And one thing that I've not generally heard when it comes to scientific discussion about any substance that transforms the body, for instance, is it having its effect largely through symbolism or through interpretation of visions. So we have this metaphysical component of it, but we also have, as I have experienced it, a symbolic way of healing that's triggered by what some guests have literally described the plants as being a technology.
That's incredible, Scott. And it makes me think of, there are a couple of groups of scientists right now who are running these really interesting studies where they have two study conditions. And in one condition, they give people a psychedelic, so let's say psilocybin, and allow the possibility of an experience like the one that you just described. In the other condition, they give people the psilocybin, but they also give them an anesthetic that knocks them out. And so basically what they've done is they're holding the neurobiology constant. So both people are the same neural activity, the same neurotransmitters are getting activated by the psilocybin, but in one condition, you get to have that subjective experience, that rich imagery, that sort of processing, and in the other condition you don't get any of that because you're asleep the whole time. And so the research question there is, does basically, to put it in common language, does the trip matter? Does the experience that you had, and then later your ability to look back on that experience and remember it and reinterpret it and reflect upon it, are all those things part of how these medicines work? Or is it the case that it's really just a neurobiology problem and those experiences don't matter? I think we're still waiting for the results of these studies, so the data are still coming in. I will tell you that my hypothesis would be that subjective experience, it matters quite a lot. It's very important.
Yeah, and I can almost hear myself, as well as a chorus of other people, saying, in a way, what's the point of the whole thing without it? This image of Anubis pointing me through a river into the abyss is something that's been so profound. I've actually commissioned a painting of it, and I showed this image to my spouse, who wants this painting in our house. It is so beautiful. It is so affecting. It speaks on such a primal level. And to not have that, well, I guess everyone has their own choices. Maybe there are those people that are like, I don't like art. I don't like subjective spiritual experiences. I just want to have an outcome. If then the results are mixed, I'm almost gathering that you're saying that additional scientific research could conceivably even point more clearly as to directions people might want to take vis-a-vis psychedelic or plant medicine treatments or experiences.
Absolutely. And it's not hard to imagine a person who is maybe interested in trying a psilocybin assisted therapy for treatment-resistant depression, that they haven't been able to get relief from after years and years of other treatments, or post-traumatic stress disorder that has continued despite treatment, and for some reason just isn't interested in having that foundation shaking experience that we know is part of the experience most commonly of taking a psychedelic medicine. There are lots of reasons to not want to do it, and I certainly wouldn't pass judgment on anybody for making one choice over the other. But there is this sort of interesting scientific question of, do you get the same bang for your buck if you sleep through the whole thing? And maybe you still get some bang, but maybe it's less or it's different. And this is what we need studies like these to really unpack for us.
So I'm imagining, sort of thinking a little bit more about what you just said. Two people. One of them has had treatment resistant PTSD for years. And we've had guests who have faced that. And they really might just want to bang for the buck. And they might say to themselves, I don't need Anubis in my life. I just want to feel better. And they might say, then let me do the quote unquote, assuming the science backs it up, the more efficient route of just going to sleep and taking some medicine or having some treatment that doesn't have the trip associated with it. Then there might be someone else like me who says, I want that experience. I want that additional richness in my life. I want that beauty. I want that pain. I want that emotion. I want everything. And that person is, in a way, not just seeking mental health treatment strictly, but they're seeking a whole experience. To what extent, then, will science, can science, would science, at least within its current paradigm, even really focus on that latter group? Because they're seeking an outcome that is almost inherently unmeasurable. How would, unless, correct me if I'm wrong, but how would a scientist say, well, that vision was meaningful or not, right? And it was meaningful at what level and in what way and what made it meaningful? And if so, then how would that impact how science treats these substances and how we are assessing these substances from an empirical perspective going forward?
Oh, Scott, there's so much here to unpack. We could talk about this one thing for hours, I think.
Wow.
So something that I'll say is, so clinical psychology as a field is largely concerned with clinical syndromes, depression, anxiety, and so forth. The symptoms of these syndromes and helping people to feel better. That's kind of the cornerstone of that field. And that is, of course, related to meaning making, to existential concerns. There is a whole established field of existential psychotherapy that has a solid evidence base behind it. So these are all things that are part of the conversation, but they're often a little bit on the side of the conversation. And I think what is different about psychedelics is that we have to take all of these variables that we normally think about as maybe being side effects. So like you get remission from depression with the side effect of more meaning and purpose in your life. With psychedelics, I think we have to sort of flip the equation on its head a little bit, because of what happens for a lot of people during the trip or the actual experience of the dosing.
Deanna, this has been a conversation that is so complex, so rich, and so challenging that it's, in a way, beautifully difficult to completely wrap my arms around. And I really do feel like we could have a zillion conversations that go on for hours and hours and hours about this stuff. If there is one takeaway, though, that I am pulling from everything that you've shared, it's that if we're sitting around and waiting for the scientific evidence to prove that these substances are worth taking, particularly if you're talking about having a clinical issue that you want resolved, you might be waiting forever. If there are things that we use all the time that we don't understand how they work, and still we might not understand everything about their impacts, okay, again, we all only are on this earth for so long. We have to make a decision at some point. If there is any takeaway that you would like to share, or any additional thought that you would like to leave our listeners or those watching this on YouTube with, what might that be?
Hard to distill it down into just one thought.
Yes.
So I agree with almost everything that you said, but I will just add that in the relative to all of the other medicines that we use that we're still learning about,
yes,
we know less about psychedelics than we do about most of that other stuff. So this field is just so new. I think I wasn't going to go here in this conversation, but I'm going to go here now. So here's another thing that Webdelics listeners might find interesting about the state of our science. Right now, a lot of the research, I mentioned that research on psychedelics is very, very expensive. Right now, a lot of the research is coming from private funding sources. So foundations and philanthropists who have named psychedelic medicines as a priority. And I think that is wonderful. And, I give a little bow of gratitude to all of those folks because they are the reason largely that our science is progressing. That said, if we really want to grow the science and grow the science quickly, I think it does need to become a national funding priority. And there needs to be funding from our own national institutes of health to support the research questions that are part of all of this. And so I think it's worth acknowledging that is part of the puzzle too, that we as scientists are working as fast as we possibly can with the resources that we have. And the more resources that are made available, the more that we'll be able to do, and more quickly.
I wanted that little segment to possibly be the end of the show. But when we end the show by opening Pandora's box, somehow I just can't let everything fly out. So anyone watching or listening to the show, this was the first and maybe the only time I will ever not close the show after the guest gives their takeaway, because I do have to ask this question in light of what you said. 2 issues. 1, is there a threshold of knowledge or data within which a governmental entity will agree to commit itself to this, particularly in an environment that has historically been hostile to substances described as quote unquote drugs like psychedelics? So again, number 1 question is there a threshold beyond which a government is more easily persuaded to fund? Number 2, would such funding and such research at this point carry any weight anyway? That's my challenge back. Look at vaccines, for instance, with regards to COVID. Those received extensive government funding and they were backed by major governmental figures in terms of their implementation. And suffice it to say, at least in the United States, I would argue that there was a pretty loud pocket of resistance. And vaccines have not had anywhere near the historical stigma associated with them that psychedelics have. So question number 2 is, do you really think that governmental funding and governmental support of the study of these substances would matter that much? I know that's a challenging question, but I have to ask it.
Yeah. So to question number 1, some of this is a little bit beyond the boundaries of my own expertise, but I will just say that some psychedelics, so psilocybin, for example, does have a clearance that makes it possible to study it through the FDA and in the context of a clinical trial. And this is a new development. And this is why we are now seeing more research. To the question of does it matter? I would say it does matter. And we're talking about something that's a bit different than a vaccine. So a lot of the research that I am personally involved with through my own lab at Emory is concerned with understanding the mechanisms of psilocybin assisted therapy treatment. So, in other words, in the context of a treatment that involves both psilocybin and psychotherapy, what is the thing that makes this effective, and how do we know, and how does this show up in people's lives? And the reason that these questions are so important is that they can make for better treatments, and that they can make for higher quality treatment that a person who wants to seek this type of therapy can have access to. Then, as a second step, the research makes it possible to potentially bill insurance for this sort of stuff. So I would say that yes, it matters because it expands our knowledge of what good care is. And that means that we can expand access to that good care, and also that we can start to ask insurance companies to pay for it. And so I think there is a real impact on people's lives from that kind of science. So I would say yes.
And when you talk about insurance companies and the ability to actually pay for treatment, all right, I'm listening. Heck yeah, that does matter. Deanna, you talked a little bit about your research. I know that people that are listening to or watching this are going to be dying to know all about you. You talked to us a little bit earlier about yourself, but where can we find out more about you? Where can we just take in all of this Deanna-ness, learn more, and keep up with what you're doing?
Yeah, well, I would love to hear from any Webdelics listeners. If you have any reactions to this conversation, I would love to hear about it. I confess I'm not super active on the social medias. You can find me on Twitter, Dr. Deanna Kaplan. I think at Deanna Kaplan PhD. The best way to connect with me, honestly, is gonna just be through my lab website or to shoot me an email. And Scott, I'll give those to you to stick in the show notes so that your listeners can have them.
Absolutely terrific. I'm sure they're going to be crying out for it. I know I already am. In the meantime, if you have enjoyed today's conversation, make sure that you tell everyone that you know about what we at Webdelics are doing. We would love to pass the word on and get as many folks as possible engaged in the conversation. In addition, be sure to join us for a whole series of really deep, insightful, and candid episodes on a whole number of topics related to substances like ketamine and psilocybin that are coming up starting within the next few episodes. While you're doing all of that, be sure to follow us on our social media, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, and then go to our website at webdelics.com. That's WEBDELICS.com. Sign up to our email list and our blog for trusted, vetted, and credible scientific information. Finally, make sure that you subscribe to the show on your favorite audio platform or on YouTube. And if you like what we're doing, as I'm sure you do, make sure that you leave a positive review or a comment on YouTube. Then make sure that you come back next time for another episode of the Webdelics podcast.